Well, Your Honor, I don't think any of us can go out of our houses without leaving DNA all over the place.
Not go to a crime scene.
The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial. The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun. To dream, believe.
Let's listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And as you heard Ann Taylor say in the opening there, how something gets somewhere, well, that's for the trial. Does Ann Taylor have a plan for how that knife sheath got somewhere that she's holding for the trial? You bet she does. And what's awesome about the way that that defense team operates is they set up their arguments over a period of time, and you can follow their plan step by step of what their arguments are going to be. We're going to expose it in this episode. And I just got to say this, because I've listened to people out there talk about, well, if Kohberger had a high-powered attorney, that he would have been much better, especially with the arguments in that hearing, bringing that stuff home. And she just didn't do a good job with that. I mean, y'all are idiots. I mean, anybody that thinks that is moron. Because let me tell you, all you have to do is listen to the way that Ann Taylor responds when the judge interrupts her, hits her with what I call an objection. I mean, it's almost like Ann Taylor is a very experienced person as it comes to overcoming objections on the fly. I mean, it's like she has training in it. Because when that judge fires off out of nowhere, you can't be prepared for a judge firing off a question or an objection to you in the middle of your presentation. But what Ann Taylor does is she calms herself and she takes whatever objection that judge throws at her, and she's able to, on the fly, develop a counter argument and overcome the objection. I mean, it's a very hard skill to master, and she has mastered it, and she does an amazing job at it. And if you want a comparison, look at the way that Ashley Jennings responds when the judge throws her an objection. She goes, does that answer your question, Your Honor? It's an answer. I mean, absolutely terrible. In comparison, I mean, the judge, she says, well, there's additional male DNA. And he says, well, doesn't that just go to show that, it wasn't necessarily, Kohberger by himself, that there was additional perpetrators? Wouldn't it lend to that? What does she do immediately? She goes, well, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up, Judge. Yeah, maybe that was a question if it was presented to the magistrate that they could have had. Maybe here's another question. Maybe because there's other male DNA, maybe it's not Bryan. But the magistrate never got to ask any of those questions because none of it was presented to her. For her to come back that quick and make that strong of an argument on an objection the judge threw at her out of nowhere, that takes skill. You can't hire that most of the time, I assure you. So people out there that want to dog on Ann Taylor and say that, she didn't make her argument and a good attorney would have, I'm sorry, they're buckos, but you're wrong. If you had an excellent attorney, they would probably start stuttering as soon as that judge opened his mouth. And she doesn't do that. She comes back hard and overcomes his objections every time he throws one. So excellent job. Back to the subject at hand, though. What is the defense's strategy once this gets to trial? because if the judge doesn't throw this thing out, it will go to trial. They're not making a deal. She's got an innocent client. She knows it. And we all know it now. But when this thing goes to trial, she has a strategy on that knife sheath. As far as Kohberger's DNA, I'm sure her strategy is going to be to attack the science, but she doesn't have any discovery for the science, so it's going to be hard for her to attack it. So she's already shown what she's going to use to attack the DNA. She says it over and over again. This was done in secret. This was done in secret. The FBI, the investigators, the Idaho State Police, they manipulated the evidence here. They omitted the evidence there. They lied about this. And then we've got this big thing that's a secret they won't show us. How can we trust that when they've lied about everything else? That's how she'll attack the DNA. And I think that'll be the best strategy that she can use to attack it, because they won't give her the discovery on it, because the discovery doesn't exist. So that is how she'll attack the DNA on the knife sheath. How she attacks how the knife sheath got there, though, is a totally different story. And she's been setting it up for a long time, and we're going to expose it in this video. So I'm going to let you listen to that clip I started out with one more time so you know why we're at where we're at. And then we're going to uncover what the strategy is. And then at the end of this video, I'll prove what the strategy that we uncovered was, that it was in fact the right strategy. Let's roll.
That's the Riley case. If you have a cell phone that gets taken at an arrest out of a car, a subsequent warrant to search the cell phone is required. So we think a warrant was required for these subsequent searches, and there was no warrant in this case. There's an expectation of privacy.
I struggle with, I struggle, to be frank, and where you're going to have to try to convince me, I guess, is I struggle with the idea that DNA left at a crime scene, that there's any expectation of privacy by someone who leaves DNA at a crime scene, that DNA can't be, as you say, searched without a warrant to establish identity.
Well, Your Honor, I don't think any of us can go out of our houses without leaving DNA all over the place.
Not go to a crime scene.
The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial. Well, Your Honor, I don't think any of us can go out of our houses without leaving DNA all over the place.
Not go to a crime scene.
The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial. The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial.
Now that we know by declaration of Ann Taylor that that argument is for the trial, how the knife sheath actually got there, then is there any indication throughout the court record that gives us the thought of how she's going to present that knife sheath actually arrived at the location that it did? Does she have any ideas, you think? Has she let us in on anything? I think so. Let's look at this. We can see in this response, way back in June of 2023, the defense team started laying the groundwork for exactly how they're going to attack the DNA on the knife sheath. And it says on factual background, on November 13th, 2022, keywords, law enforcement, responding to a 911 call. You got to remember that. Found Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan deceased. Law enforcement later found a K-bar knife sheath placed next to Miss Mogan on her bed. The sheath was placed button side down and partially under Miss Mogan and the comforter. And then on November 20th, 2022, the ISP lab in Meridian located DNA on the button of the sheath and performed STR analysis that led nowhere when ran through CODIS, other than to show the provider was a male. So the argument, though, that the defense laid out way back then was law enforcement responding to the 911 call found the victims deceased. Law enforcement later found a K-bar knife sheath placed next to Miss Mogan. It was placed button side down. So they're not saying law enforcement responded to a 911 call and then found the victims deceased and found the knife sheath underneath Maddie, meaning one of the frat boys or the people that were in the house with the roommates placed it there. No, law enforcement found the bodies deceased, but then law enforcement later, after they found the bodies deceased, found the K-bar knife sheath placed next to Mogan on her bed. So what her argument here is saying, if you read between the lines, is sometime between when officers responded to the 911 call and found Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan deceased, sometime between then and when detectives arrived, that knife sheath was placed there. So that's only going to leave a few people that would have the ability to place that knife sheath there. That's the argument that was started a long time ago, and let me show you how it continues to bolster over time. Okay, so if the argument is once law enforcement arrived, between the time they got there and the time that you read in the PCA that Payne and Blaker find the knife sheath, I know it really just says Payne does, but by the time you read that, Anna's saying the knife sheath was placed there in between when they first arrived and when the detectives got there and noticed the sheath. So who would have been the most likely candidate to place that sheath there? Well, there was 3 officers that arrived. We know one of them, based on the probable cause affidavit, was Officer Nunez. But was he the first to arrive and the first to enter? No. We have definitive proof who the first to arrive and the first to enter was. Let's talk about it. Okay, we now know that the first officer on the scene at the King Road residence, you'll see him right here, was Officer Shane Gunderson. Not only was he the first one on the scene, but he was the ranking officer on the scene when the officers entered the King Road residence. And we also have learned a lot more about the details surrounding when this crime was discovered and when other law enforcement arrived that would have access to the residence. Let me show you. Okay, so you can see right here, it says Gundy reported to work that morning at 6 a.m. That was November 13th, 2022. He was reporting to duty on a 12-hour shift starting at 6 a.m. Now, at 11:58 a.m., Gundy was the only officer, he was actually the sergeant at the station, and he was responsible for taking the unconscious person call at 11:58 a.m. from the 911 dispatcher. Now, the 911 dispatcher was a routed call, and they were undertrained, it turned out. So whenever they hear things like, somebody's unalived, they're trained to report it as a unconscious person because they don't have the skills to go into in depth any more than that. So when they relayed the call to Gundy at 11:58, according to him, he thought it was just an unconscious person call. Now, he was the sergeant on duty. He was in charge of operations, and he was at the station, which you can see on the map here is less than a mile from the King Road residence. Now, he had 2 officers and a corporal that he could have dispatched to the home, but he decided that day he was going to take it upon himself to be the first one there. It was also his responsibility to contact EMS, which apparently he did not do. That's why the EMS did not arrive before the officers did. So once they arrive, Gundy, being the ranking officer, he was the first to enter the King Road residence. He entered with Nunez and the other officer. Now, entered the residence and seen the victims deceased, Gundy then called his captain, Captain Lanier. And he had to call Lanier because Chief Fry left on the 12th, and he was on a mini vacation during this time. So he called Captain Lanier. Lanier put Gundy in charge, told him to contact the Idaho State Police and secure the crime scene. So from the time that Gundy and crew arrived, they were in charge of making sure nobody else went in that house but them. And Officer Gundy was in charge of that crime scene from the time they secured it until Idaho State Police arrived, which we don't really know what time that was, but we know that the other detectives didn't arrive until 4 p.m. So how much sooner did Idaho State Police arrive before them? The point is, there was plenty of time while Gundy, who was in charge of that scene, to go back into the house. And I'm not saying he did it, but I'm saying the defense is going to say it's quite possible he did it. Placed the knife sheath underneath Miss Mogan in the room upstairs. Now, how do you know all that, Pavarotti? Well, it came from the horse's mouth himself, Officer Gunderson. And who did he tell it to? Well, it's in the footnotes of his book that he got it from Gunderson. Gunderson told the entire story to Howard Bloom. And Howard Bloom wrote it in his book, devoted a whole chapter to it, and noted in his footnotes that it came from Officer Gunderson. So it came from the horse's mouth. Now, the real question is, why would the defense suspect Officer Gundy of being the one who planted the knife sheath? So it turns out this book is actually both fact and fiction. So it's just, you have to be able to discern the fact from the fiction. The fact is statements from people. Fiction is anything that he thinks of. But one thing that I've learned over watching many, many interviews with Howard Bloom and reading his book is Howard Bloom has a tell. And remember, a tell is like like in poker, you have a tell. It's like a giveaway. Well, Howard Bloom has a giveaway whenever he is going to speak something of truth. And I've learned what it is. It's very easy to detect when he's about to say something that's true.
And here is how Ann Taylor is using it. She says the real question is, how did the knife sheath get there? She is now going to argue in the course of the trial that these two unknown males, either one of them or both of them, put the knife sheath on the bed. They were involved in the murder, and Kohberger, prior to the murder, had somehow innocently touched the knife sheath. The DNA on the knife sheath is just touch DNA. And she is claiming that, or will claim at the trial, that this was done innocently by Kohberger.
See his tell? If you ever want to know if Howard Bloom's about to give his actual opinion on things, just listen for the key words. Here's what the defense, or here's what Ann Taylor is going to try to do at trial. Whenever he says that, he's about to tell you exactly what he really believes. He does it in interviews, and he did it in his book. You can just tell it's different information whenever he says the defense is going to try to do this. He's really telling you what he thinks, and he's almost right there. That is part of what the defense is going to try to do. They're going to say Kohberger touched that knife sheath and somebody else put it at the crime scene. Actually, I don't even believe they're going to do that. I think she's going to say I know she's going to say somebody else placed it at the crime scene, and I believe she's going to attack whether or not that's his DNA on there due to lack of discovery. We can't trust you because you've lied on everything. Can't trust you. But who is she going to say planted the knife sheath? We've already discussed it. Do we have proof to back that up, Pavarotti? Yeah, I believe we do. As I'm going to show you, for a long time now, Ann Taylor has been trying to get training records and really all the records as it relates to, well, she says 3 officers. One of those officers, though, we know is Mr. Gunderson, even though it's misspelled in her request for discovery. But you can see request number 164. Really, all 3 of these officers she's tried to get records on. Body cam, all their body cam footage, all the recordings, all the notes, all the photographs, and all the information collected at the autopsies by Tollison, Vargas, and Gunderson. And you can see the state responded that they do not have these items in its possession. Clarification is needed on it. They exist and are still in possession of another agency. The state has been advised these items do not exist. The state has indicated in its response to prior discovery requests from the defense that the state has and will continue to provide discovery in accordance with ICR 16 and applicable law. And I can tell you, they've been trying to get this the entire time. In recent filings, this same request has never been filled. They've never got it. And what does it consist of? Body cam, recordings, notes, photographs, and all information collected at the autopsies by Tollison, Vargas, and Gunderson. What the heck was Gunderson doing at the autopsy, number one? But why can the state not produce these things? Is this a pattern? And is this a pattern specifically with Gunderson? Well, we know early on in this case, the prosecution had to disclose a Brady disclosure, and they requested for a protective order to try to keep it under wraps who that Brady disclosure was for. And you can see the Latah County Prosecuting Attorney's Office respectfully gives notice to the court and counsel that the state has become aware of potential Brady Giglio material related to one of the officers involved in the above referenced case. The material, in the form of a confidential internal affairs investigation, is hereby submitted in camera to the court. The state intends to disclose this information to defendant's counsel, but because this information is confidential and exempt from public disclosure pursuant to Idaho Code 74106, personnel records, they wanted to keep it under wraps from the public. Therefore, the need for a protective order. So everybody's always wondered who the officer was that the internal affairs investigation was for. And whoever that officer was is certainly not one that can be trusted. So if he can't be trusted and he's an integral part of the case, well, then we've got some serious doubt about things involved with that officer and things that he may have done in this case. How can we be so sure that it's Officer Gunderson? Well, we've all heard of this Stickergate thing, and you can see this was from October 27th, 2021. Moscow PD buries evidence in Stickergate case for more than a year. And it says, Moscow, Idaho. There's no credible explanation for MPD's failure to disclose this evidence as part of the January 22nd subpoena response, defense lawyer Sam Creason said, about video evidence that was released last week at a hearing. The Moscow Police Department video is key evidence in the infamous Soviet Moscow sticker case involving Nathan Wilson and his 2 sons, Rory and Seamus. This video evidence was released by Moscow PD last week during a hearing which involved testimony from MPD officers under oath. This hearing was to determine the legality of the initial interrogation of the Wilson boys by MPD back in October of 2020. Before the hearing and before going under oath, an MPD officer notified prosecutors that a video evidence did in fact exist on the night of the sticker incident. Before he went under oath, he ran up and he said, okay, there is video evidence and we know exactly where it's at and we knew it the whole time and we've been hiding it. Sergeant Gunderson, who was one of the first two MPD officers on the scene the night in question, notified prosecutors that Officer Waters, who had been the responsible officer on the scene, captured video of the incident with his squad car's dash cam. See, Sergeant Gunderson was Officer Waters' superior, and Gunderson was the first one on the scene. Now, it was Waters' car that had the dash cam, but it was Gunderson who hit it. And Gunderson said that footage was in MPD's system and that it had been in MPD's possession from the very beginning of the case. So he's the one that acknowledged that it had been there the whole time. This footage has been illegally held back from the defense by MPD in the normal course of discovery. Despite public record requests, it had still been held back by MPD. Even when a subpoena was issued in January, it was still held back illegally by MPD. More than a year now has passed since the Moscow City prosecutors in Latah County made history by filing the city's first ever criminal charges against someone for posting a sign on a flyer pole without permission. Thousands of signs and flyers and stickers have been posted on poles in the city before and since this incident. The incident happened in October 2020 when the memorable red stickers that provoked prosecution read, "Soviet Moscow enforced because we care." So the fact that it was admitted by Gunderson that he's the one that hid the evidence, and you can see it says 3 times that it was illegally held, that is what initiated the internal affairs investigation into Gunderson. That is what the Brady Giglio material says, that one of their officers had an internal affairs investigation. It was Gunderson. The defense has known it the whole time, and he is their prime candidate to accuse of planting the knife sheath. And based on his statement to Howard Bloom, he is the prime candidate to have planted the knife sheath.
Yes, Your Honor. I want to hear a little bit more on the police training records. I am aware that over 120 officers were involved in the investigation in this case. I am not asking for all 120 officers. I will tell the court that likely there are other officers' training records that I will want. This is within Idaho Criminal Rule 16. These are records, documents, and objects that may have information relevant to Mr. Kohberger's investigation and defense. These are records that are likely of witnesses. Whether or not the state calls them, they are likely to be witnesses. The 3 that I'm asking for now, they had critical roles at various stages. One of the officers did a Spillman search for 2011 to 2013, a nail entrance to get to the FBI to look through it. One of that same officer assisted in the search for records. This same officer interviewed witnesses from the scene of 1122 King Road on the 13th of November. This officer did follow up with some of the key witnesses in the case. This officer signed an Ada County lab agreement, and this officer handled and collected evidence. The second officer that I seek the information from did an interview with a key witness that's expected to testify when this case goes to trial. This officer also mentioned a specialty of working with victims and trauma victims. I think those training records are very relevant. The interview of this key witness was one of multiple interviews of this same key witness by various law enforcement officers. There is a lot of information in the various interviews that's going to come into trial. This officer may well be subpoenaed by the defense to come to trial. That person's training records are buried. The last officer did multiple interviews, I think a dozen or so, many of them after the arrest of Mr. Kohberger. This officer also interviewed key witnesses in the case. This officer attended the autopsy proceedings. This officer followed up on tips. This officer made decisions about the tips that were given to law enforcement, and this officer also collected bits of evidence. Those functions that police officers make daily in their jobs, they make decisions about a case that later comes to court. They've made decisions about the case the state's going to present against Mr. Kohberger. They talked to key witnesses. How they do their job, how they were trained to do their job, and what they relied on is incredibly important. When they take the stand, they will say, based on my training and experience, Idaho Criminal Rule 16 talks about witnesses. This is information that the defense needs to conduct its investigation and preparation. The last officer did multiple interviews, I think a dozen or so, many of them after the arrest of Mr. Kohberger. This officer also interviewed key witnesses in the case. This officer attended the autopsy proceedings. This officer followed up on tips. This officer made decisions about the tips that were given to law enforcement. And this officer also collected bits of evidence. Those functions that police officers make daily in their jobs, they make decisions about a case that later comes to court. They've made decisions about the case the state's going to present against Mr. Kohberger.
Well, Your Honor, I don't think any of us can go out of our houses without leaving DNA all over the place.
Not go to a crime scene.
The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial. The question of how something gets somewhere, that's the subject of the trial.
Now, that's all the factual information. That's pretty much all we need to determine Ann Taylor's strategy. I think you would agree. But that might just be the start of her strategy, because as I mentioned in the beginning, the defense's investigators are amazing in this case, and they have uncovered every bit as much as I have. I'd like to think maybe I've helped them a little bit along the way. By this time, they are very familiar with Farley and the role that he has played in this, and the planting of the knife sheath by Mr. Gundy. That is definitely going to be brought up, but it may just be the start. We'll just have to wait and see, because we know that there's so much more revolving around that she could bring up. Let's do a little speculating now with some of the findings of old Pav, and just remind everybody of who we're actually talking to and what it could possibly consist of. Now, just a quick refresher of what Pav has uncovered in his investigation that absolutely relates to everything we just discussed. If you remember, we have this lady right here, this gentleman right here, and his wife. They are both the parents of, or were the parents of, these two victims of the atrocity right here. And we uncovered through arrest records and other avenues that these two were associates of these two. I can directly connect these two to this one now. I'm going to expose that right before trial. But they're associates of them, and they were running narcotics from their hometown down to this gentleman in Julietta, and they had to pass through Moscow to get them to him. And we know now that this gentleman reports directly to these folks in the Idaho State Penitentiary. Now, this gentleman right here has an interesting connection to all of these people you see. You see, his uncle basically is this gentleman right here, who runs a large construction company and is best friends to this gentleman right here who is in charge of the university. Now, I believe through this gentleman's relationship with this gentleman and his power that he possesses over this judge right here, she granted this guy a furlough that he never returned on before the atrocity occurred. Now, he was in jail because these two had snitched on him, basically. Now, after the atrocity, just 10 days, he was arrested again in Spokane, Washington. But we learned that because of his relationship with this gentleman, and his nephew is this gentleman right here who happens to be part of the Quad Cities Drug Task Force, and this gentleman's influence over this gentleman, and his very close relationship to this guy right here, who's the one we've been talking about all day, who happens to, by marriage, be related to him, which in turn makes him related to him and him by marriage. So it's one big connected tree here. And by the way, this guy gave this guy and this lady, this guy twice, this lady once, about to happen again, unheard of Rule 11 plea agreements where they should have spent at least 20 years in prison and they got probation, deals of the century. Just a refresher on all that. But let's talk about him and their relationship. And how far apart on the family tree are these two? Well, you can see this guy, his father, has a sister. She has a daughter, marries this guy. So they're essentially first cousins. And let's not forget that Anne still hasn't got to the point where she's going to attack the fact that here is the Moscow Police Department where Gundy resides, and about 20 feet from there, right here is Gypsy Java, where camera footage has been removed before 5 a.m. on the night of the atrocity. And, less than about a half a mile from there is right here, which is Mundy's Machine, which the video disappeared in its entirety. And then right here, again, Wasankari Construction, where, again, the video has disappeared before 5 a.m. Nestled right in between is Germer Construction, where Farley's uncle owns it and Farley actually works. So I would imagine if she wanted to, could bring up a person who has had an internal affairs investigation for hiding video and point to that as a likely candidate for the person who removed all of those videos. So there is a lot of places Ann Taylor could go with that particular avenue of who planted the knife sheath. Now, some of that is informed opinion / speculation by Pavarotti from the private investigation I've conducted into this case. But the majority of that video is straight fact out of the court records, and as you've seen, out of court proceedings. It is no doubt what the defense's strategy is going to be to where that knife sheath came from. Now, we've got much more to cover, but I think that'll do it for this episode. I'll have you another one out tomorrow, probably after the Super Bowl, so nobody look for an early video tomorrow. But in the meantime, please like and subscribe to the channel, post your comments, thoughts, criticisms, and until next time, y'all have a happy day tomorrow. Everybody, please be safe. Even if you're not doing anything, if you get out Super Bowl day, a lot of idiots like to drink, and then some of them hit the road. You could be doing everything perfect, and then some other idiot come up, and just everybody be very careful tomorrow, please. And everybody have a wonderful day. If you want to know, if you're gambling folks and you want to know which team to bet on, let me just say I'm betting on the Kansas City Chiefs. So my record this year says if I'm betting the Chiefs, the smart bet is to bet against me. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. And until next time, Pavarotti's out.
I was an ordinary boy until I broke nation.